Hi, everyone. So I'm going to go over just a few things here. Minimal group paradigm is an idea that was created by a researcher by the last name of Tajfel. Dr. Tajfel did this work in the early 1970s with students that he recruited into his lab, and then he split them into arbitrary groups. And remember, these students knew, hey, this is short term. We're just in the lab for now, and whatever we do here, once we walk out of here, we're not going to be doing anything with this group anymore. And after dividing them up into these groups, he then created a situation whereby he needed to see if, hold on, sorry about that, going back here. He needed to see if um, how they would distribute a resource. So maybe here's a group. You're the purple group, you're the green group, you're the yellow group. Here's a resource. Your group has to choose how to distribute the resource, um, keeping in mind that you're not going to get the resource yourself. Okay, so here's what he found. Even when people were not going to get the resource, they'd prefer to give it to their own group, even if they're not going to get any, than to give it to the other group. And remember this. This is something that happened in the very short term. These people were not in the lab for very long before he gave them a resource and said, okay, you guys got to distribute this resource. You're not going to get any, but you get to distribute it however you want, to other groups, to your own group, however you wanted to do this. Most people wanted to give it to their own group, even if they weren't going to get any of that resource. Tajfel attributed this behavior to what he called in-group bias. That is the tendency for people to try to benefit members of their own group, even if they're not going to get any of that resource, they still will typically want people in their group to get it and other people in other groups not to get it. Okay, and so this is a really interesting idea because I think it's played out in societies, and not just this one, but around the world, that you have resources, your group has resources, and even if more resources come in, even if you won't get any of these new resources, you want your group to still have those resources, even other members of your group to have those resources, even if you might not get that resource. Um, and I think we can see this, for example, with healthcare. In the United States, there are people who have quality access to quality healthcare. They don't necessarily feel the need to try to ensure that everyone else has access to quality healthcare because they have access to quality healthcare, and so do other members of their group. And so, if there's more resources toward quality healthcare, they want more of that for themselves. They don't necessarily feel the need to spread it around to others. That's just my take on it. There's realistic group conflict theory, and realistic group conflict theory is the idea that there is a lot of competition in all societies for access to resources. There's not enough resources for everybody to get. So, for example, we think about housing, access to quality healthcare, access to quality education, jobs or careers that are fulfilling. There are not enough of these things to go around. And so realistic group conflict theory says because of this competition between and among the various groups and societies, each group will create these negative beliefs, the stereotypes about those other groups, and that will, of course, engender these negative feelings, the prejudices about members of those other groups. And again, I think you can see this play out again when we think about healthcare. People who have access to quality healthcare, they don't necessarily want to give anything up so that other people can have the same access. They want to keep as much of it for themselves as they can. Their idea might be, well, I don't see why I have to share what I have because I've worked hard for it, and that other group hasn't worked hard for it. Therefore, they're lazy, and all the negative ideas and stereotypes that are engendered as a result of that kind of competition. Also, I want to point out the idea of scapegoating. Scapegoating is a really important idea in both social psychology and sociology. It's really this idea that there are some people who will blame other people for their group's problems or for their own personal problems. And a great example of this, it's an unfortunate example of this, I should say, is when in the 1980s, there was a young man named Vincent Chin. He was a young student, graduate student at the Chinese American student at a university in Detroit, Michigan, University of Michigan. He was working in the lab late one night. He stopped on his way home at a local bar that also served food. He ordered a burger and a beer, sat there and ate it. He left the bar slash restaurant and continued to walk home. Unfortunately for him, there were several, about 4 or 5 people also in the bar restaurant at the time who were laid off auto workers. These people had lost their jobs because of the low numbers of American cars being sold in the mid 1980s. They assumed that, and of course, the feeling was by these auto workers that it was because of all these damn Japanese cars that people were buying. And since they were buying Japanese cars, they're not buying American cars. Therefore, they lost their jobs. These gentlemen followed this young man. They then pushed him into an alley and they beat him so badly that he died there on the street. They were blaming this young man for their problems, scapegoating, even though really he was not Japanese or Japanese American, he was Chinese American. But to them, it didn't matter. He was a symbol of all that was wrong in their lives, and they took it out on him. Unfortunately, he died. Also, want to point out authoritarianism, or also this is known as the authoritarian personality. There are some people who grow up in families whereby, or social groups, whereby there is a requirement that you adhere to very strict rules or guidelines or morals. These social groups also typically are lacking caring and love and affection. And so what these individuals do is they learn that adhering to these rigid, stringently adhering to these rigid rules or laws or morals will at least get them some degree of social approval from those around them. As adults and young adults, then, they become very judgmental and intolerant of anyone who doesn't also adhere very strictly to those rules or morals or guidelines that they learned. And so somebody who is very inflexible in regard to how they think about behavior and morals is much more likely to be prejudiced and to have stereotypes um, against people who do not follow the kinds of rigid rules that they do. Finally, I want to point out that there is something that we know can do, that we can use to try to reduce prejudice and stereotypes. Okay, we know that we can do this. And I believe that it is mentioned in the text. And so I'm just going to go to a discussion of it right now. It's called the Robbers Cave experiment, and it's very well known. It was done in the 50s, and it has been replicated since then. And I'll give you a real world example of how we see this happening. Essentially, it involves this: taking two groups, and if there's animosity amongst these two groups, or more, two or more groups, if you put those groups together and you give them a task to work on together, that's one thing that has to be worked on together. Everybody has to help working on this task. Also, you value the work of everyone in the group equally. And third, everyone benefits from the outcome of working together. Then what we tend to see is that the stereotypes and the prejudice are reduced. And the original experiment, the Robbers Cave experiment, It was a researcher who took a group of boys, recruited them to go to summer camp. Once they got to summer camp, he split the boys into 2 different groups. The boys were encouraged to come up with their own names for their group. They slept in separate tents, etc. They ate meals separately. They trained separately. They played sports separately. And then when it looked as though each group had solidified a group identity, the boys were made to, they had competition, sports competition. So baseball games, they played against each other, tug of war, whatever. So summer camp. After several days of this, and the researcher saw the boys had began to develop negative attitudes toward the boys of the other group, calling them names and um, creating stereotypes of those other boys. Then the researcher did something novel. He told the boys that there was a truck that was coming to the camp and bringing supplies and food, and the truck couldn't get to the camp because the bridge had collapsed in the middle, and that the boys would have to work together to repair the bridge. The boys spent a day repairing the bridge, and at the end of the day, once the truck came over and brought the supplies, the boys were given a choice. Do you want to eat separately as you normally do, or do you want to eat your dinner together? Boys chose to eat dinner together. The next morning, they were given a choice. Do you want to continue to eat separately, or do you want to continue to eat your meals together? Overwhelmingly, the boys chose they wanted to eat their meals together. It turns out that all those negative feelings and stereotypes had been broken down because the boys had to work together. The work of everyone was valued equally, and everyone benefited from the bridge being rebuilt. So I leave you with this thought. We know what to do to reduce prejudice and discrimination, but will we do it? That's the question.